The Opium Wars, China's clash with the West. History is full of turning points, moments when empires fall, power dynamics shift, and the world moves on a different trajectory. The Opium Wars, fought between the Qing Dynasty in China and Western powers led by Britain, are one such chapter. They weren't just military conflicts, but profound clashes of culture, trade, and sovereignty. These wars left an indelible mark on China's history, pushing it into a period of crisis and transformation that continues to shape its national identity to this day. Today, we'll unravel how the opium trade became the catalyst for these wars, why they occurred, and their far-reaching consequences. This is a saga of power, resistance, and the devastating cost of imperial ambition. To understand how the Opium Wars began, we need to look at China in the early 19th century. The Qing Dynasty was an empire that prided itself on being a self-sufficient civilization. Its agricultural system was advanced, producing enough food to sustain a massive population, while its economy thrived off the production of goods highly coveted by foreign markets. Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain had become commodities that Europeans adored. In fact, Britain had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese tea. However, there was one big problem. China didn't need or want most European manufactured goods. To ensure control, China operated under the Canton system, which restricted foreign trade to a single port, Guangzhou, formerly Canton. This arrangement worked for China, but for Britain, it created a significant trade imbalance. British merchants were spending vast amounts of silver to buy Chinese goods, draining their national reserves. The British needed a solution to reverse this imbalance, and they found it in a highly controversial commodity, opium. Opium, derived from the poppy plant, had been used in medicine for centuries, but by the late 18th and early 19th century, British merchants had begun cultivating it in India and smuggling it into China. Despite being illegal, the demand for opium grew rapidly, and people from all walks of life in China became addicted. By the early 1800s, the opium trade was causing severe problems. Millions of Chinese citizens developed crippling addictions, while the Qing Dynasty saw their economy take a hit as silver flowed out of the country to pay for the drug. For Britain, this was a financial triumph. Opium became the key to bypassing China's economic restrictions. However, for the Chinese people, the substance inflicted a devastating toll on families, society, and public health. The Qing government recognized the crisis for what it was, not just a drug epidemic, but a direct threat to the stability and morality of their empire. In 1839, the Qing Emperor Daoguang decided to take decisive action. To enforce his ban on opium, he appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu, a firm, morally upright official, to lead the crackdown. Lin Zexu wasted no time in confronting the issue head-on. He famously wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to Britain's moral conscience. In it, he argued that Britain would not tolerate its own people being subjected to such harm, so why inflict it on China? The letter went unanswered. Undeterred, Lin intensified his campaign. In one dramatic act, he seized over 20,000 chests of opium from British merchants in Canton. These were publicly destroyed in a striking display near Human, where the opium was dissolved into the sea. However, this bold act of resistance had dire consequences. British merchants, enraged by the loss of their opium stocks, called for Britain to retaliate. What began as an economic dispute would escalate into a full-blown war. The First Opium War exposed a brutal imbalance of power between Britain and China. While the Qing dynasty's military had weapons and naval vessels rooted in older technologies, Britain had undergone the Industrial Revolution, equipping itself with advanced steam-powered gunboats and long-range artillery. British forces struck at key locations along China's coast, targeting both strategic military points and economic hubs. These battles revealed the massive technological gap between the two sides. Places like Canton and Nanking fell quickly under British control, leaving the Qing Dynasty scrambling to defend their territory. By the war's end in 1842, Qing leaders realized they were outmatched. China's ancient military strategies stood no chance against Britain's modernized navy. Facing mounting losses, they had no choice but to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, marked the end of the First Opium War and the beginning of a dark period in China's history. Often called the first of the unequal treaties, it forced China into giving massive concessions to Britain. Under the treaty, China had to cede Hong Kong to British control, a move whose ramifications are still felt today. The treaty also required China to open 5 key ports to Western trade and to pay huge reparations for the opium confiscated and Britain's war expenses. Perhaps most humiliating was the concept of extraterritoriality. British nationals living in China were no longer subject to Chinese law. They were governed instead by British laws, even on Chinese soil. This provision deeply eroded the Qing Dynasty's sovereignty and respectability. But while the Treaty of Nanking ended the First Opium War, it didn't resolve the underlying tensions between China and the West. In fact, it planted the seeds for another conflict. By the mid-1850s, relationships between China and Western powers remained fragile. Britain pushed for more trade privileges, while the Qing government tried to push back against mounting foreign interference. However, another diplomatic dispute pushed the two sides back to war. The Second Opium War brought not only Britain, but also France into the fold. Both countries launched coordinated military campaigns, further demonstrating their advanced firepower and exploiting China's vulnerabilities. One of the most infamous events of this war was the destruction of the old summer palace, Yuanmingyuan, in 1860. British and French troops looted and burned the magnificent imperial palace in Beijing, destroying priceless cultural artifacts in the process. By the war's conclusion, China was again defeated. The resulting treaties, the treaties of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking, demanded even harsher terms. Opium trade was legalized, new trade ports were opened, and foreign diplomats gained unprecedented access to Beijing. The Opium Wars ushered in what is often referred to as China's century of humiliation. The once mighty Qing Dynasty was left weakened, with its sovereignty in tatters and its control over its territory reduced. Foreign powers carved China into spheres of influence, dictating trade policies and exploiting resources. Domestically, the wars exposed the dynasty's vulnerability and inability to protect its people from external forces. This vulnerability incited internal uprisings, such as the Taiping Rebellion, a devastating civil war that claimed millions of lives. While the imperial government faced increasing dissent, some reformers sought to modernize China to better compete with Western powers. These movements were limited in success due to internal corruption and resistance to change. Today, the Opium Wars are remembered as a watershed moment in modern Chinese history. They symbolize the destructive reach of imperialism and the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. But they also serve as a reminder of perseverance, sparking a push for reform and modernization that would eventually lead to revolutionary change. The humiliation China faced laid the groundwork for the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1912 and the rise of the Republic of China. Later, in the 20th century, the memory of the Opium Wars fueled a sense of national unity and determination to resist foreign control. Globally, the wars illustrate the harms of economic exploitation and imperial ambition, issues that remain relevant today. They highlight the historical struggle between stronger, industrialized nations and vulnerable states caught in their grasp. The Opium Wars were more than just battles. They were a clash of empires, economies, and ideologies. The human and cultural damage was profound, and the consequences rippled throughout the centuries that followed. While this chapter in history is deeply painful, it also contains lessons about resilience and the pursuit of justice. It reminds us of the importance of sovereignty, of protecting cultural heritage, and of recognizing the devastating cost of prioritizing profits over people. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of history's most pivotal moments. If you enjoyed this dive into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. History is filled with lessons. We'd love to hear what the Opium Wars taught you about the forces that shape our world. See you in the next story.